I'd like to welcome everybody to our monthly art talk, the Sasse Museum of Art.
Thank you. It's a special treat to be here. Thank all of you for coming and being a part of this evening. Special thanks to George Cuttress, who has represented my work for a number of decades, and for Jean as his support for me from the museum, and Momo for her support in setting the show up. It's been very exciting. There's 40 pieces in the show, and it's been a very full year preparing for this. The work wrestles with a number of questions that I have. This idea of the vertical and the horizontal, standing and laying, sleeping and living, birthing and dying. And I find these themes really important to think about, talk about, wrestle with. That's why you'll find nests in the show. All the nests have fallen from trees into my yard. I won't ever take a nest out of a tree. There's oriole nests, there's crow's nests, and finch nests are the ones that you'll see in the show. And there's something about the nest, it seems very feminine, very protective, about birth, about vulnerability. And the boats seem to be an extension of that. This elongation, almost coffin-like, human-like in form. I love the idea that Moses is delivered in a reed boat, and then we cross the river Styx in another boat. Throughout all this mythology and history, boats have an important role to play. In the narrative poem Odysseus by Homer, if you've read that or heard about Ulysses and his travels and the journey on the ship and all the things that go wrong, and he makes it back safely after years of a hardship. And what people don't remember is at the very end of the book, Odysseus is sent on a second journey. And the second journey, it's fascinating. Instead of going on ship, he's sent inland. And he's instructed to carry an oar until no one knows what an oar is. And then he has to plant it before he returns back to his home. And so the centerpiece in the show is a standing figure with an oar tied to it. And it's about that idea of the inward journey. In Odysseus, it's inland, but I think it's symbolic for the inward journey. The journey that the tools of our outdoor life don't work. Our careers, our fame, our finances, our homes, our cars, none of that makes any difference inside, except maybe to harden us and make us less connected to reality. So the inner journey, we can't use the same tools, they're different tools. And so you notice the figures don't have arms. Arms are too powerful. It's about not having that power. It's about this inner place where we have to think differently, live differently. The only place with arms is the female whose arms are trapped in the wall, and her inability to carry out her longing, and the nest is below her. But the nest is empty. She already did her work. And there's someone else who has to carry on that work. In the back room, you'll find a very large boat out of mulberry branches. A beautiful branch that I was able to harvest off a tree that was being cut down. So it's symbolic of saving the last remnants of this beautiful tree. And I was in the backyard by my studio on a very windy day, and I saw this crow's nest leave one of the palm trees, and the wind brought it and dropped it on my back lawn. Stunning, very stunning, unusual. It landed intact. So I built the boat to hold the nest. So it's a 10-foot boat holding this 2-foot nest. And it seemed like I had to honor the gift, right? This nest was given to me. I had to do something that honored this beautiful event. And so the boat, people think I'm a little crazy because I'm building a boat that can't float out of branches and twine and old rusty metal chains. And but there's something about the need to have to make it. It wasn't like I had a choice. I had to honor this experience. So the boats have been peeking into my work for a number of years. And then a year ago, I realized, oh, I need to address this directly. And that's how this show came about. And George invited me, and then COVID delayed it, which was great. I got more work done and added. And so the boats landed on the heads. They are in the body, their memory, their experience, their mystery, their dreams. They carry our prayers. They carry our longings. So I was trying to make visual poetry. I was trying to make objects that carried a poetic sensibility or a poetic truth. It used to be poetic knowledge was a normal part of the world until we stopped believing and realized and thought that science was going to give us everything we needed. And we took poetic truth and set it aside. And so I'm part of a lot of discussions about spirituality and what's true and what isn't. And I think sometimes the parables and the narratives that come in our religious texts have more power because they're poetic than if they were scientific. It doesn't matter if Noah was real or not. He's in a boat. That matters to me, right? It's beautiful. It's this picture of surviving the difficulties of life and starting fresh. So for me, the poetic truths of life are much more interesting than the scientific. Oh, sometimes they mix. You'll see there's some pieces in the show that have to do with the night sky and the constellations. And the idea that out on the open sea, the deep pelagic, where there's no land, there are no landmarks, there's no guide, except for the stars and the sun and the moon. And so they become the map. Rather than the map being below, the map is above. And when the water is still, the map is reflected, and you get to see it in both places. So this idea of trying to navigate life, trying to make sense of life, is a challenge. Scott Peck, in his book, The Road Less Traveled, has 3 words to start the book off. And he just says, life is difficult. And the rest of the book is, what do we do now? How do we respond to that? What do we do with that difficulty? So for me, my studio is a place where I wrestle with poetic truth, with poetic understanding, not necessarily with answers, but with what do I do with difficulty? How do I process that, right? And in my earlier years, it was a lot more about suffering, and the work was much darker. I found humanity to be very disappointing. Right now, there's a mass shooting every week. It's like, what is wrong with us? Right? What is wrong with humans? Why can't we make life better? And so I've wrestled with how dark human is, the human soul, unable to love, to care, to come alongside and help. And as I have spent a few decades thinking about this and wrestling with this, I realized, okay, it only can happen if I make a difference. If I do the work. If I go inland until no one knows what all my accreditations mean, my degrees mean nothing. If I go inward, success has no matter. You find a place where no one cares. They want to know, do you love me? Do you care about me? Are you safe? That's what matters. And so for me, the studio process is attempting to find visuals that talk about suffering, but also talk about hope, that talk about our limitations, that talk about possibilities. What is possible, how to visualize that, how to talk about it, how to think about it. And, poetry's struggles, but it's coming back. Have you noticed there's this resurgence right now of the poetic language? Also in spoken word form, it's got more ways in which it's reaching through. Like in the 60s, it was through music, right? The whole beat culture, trying to find ways to find words, and rap tried to find words to say something that mattered. And now you've got this blending of so many different musical genres trying to find language. So we're all trying to find a way to make sense out of the difficulties of life. Well, turning into philosophy here a little bit, but that's how I'm wired. The boat is actually the almond shape, which is also the vaginal shape or the birth canal. So many religious buildings throughout all of Europe have that almond shape over the doorway. And it speaks of this, it's almost like a torii gate in Japan, this separation between the sacred and the common or the secular. That boat shape or the nest shape is the transitional place where we can leave one world and enter into the next. That's what I hope is happening. And women are better at that than men. Men sometimes have a hard time letting go of power, and women seem to be able to serve easier. At least they choose to more often than men. I'd like to see men step up and do a better job of that. Actually, the spirituality never left the artists. It's just the curators and the museum directors left it out of the wall text and the catalogs. And if you look back through the last 150 years, a very large percentage of artists were deeply connected to the invisible and to the spiritual. In fact, I had this idea that all visual art is what you would call incarnational, if to use a Christian word, where the invisible becomes visible, where what you can't see is seen. So it's like our ideas are invisible, and as soon as we make an object out of it, we've incarnated it. We've taken this invisible idea and we've given it physical form. So I think art making in itself is deeply spiritual. But much of contemporary art has to do with disdain and a kind of knocking away of culture and really becoming almost decorative in many cases. But when I walk into a gallery or museum, I always withhold judgment for at least a minute. I'm serious. Sit with that piece for a minute and say, okay, the artist had an intent. They made something. It's art. It may just not be my taste, right? Because so many people walk, I've seen them in museums, and you hear them, they go, that's not art. I'm like, well, who are you? You don't get to say that. You don't go into a library and say, that's not a book. You may not want to read it. You may not like the content. So art has this set of formulas for it to be made, right? A kind of set of rules. And I think inherently in that is spirituality. It just hasn't been considered part of the dialogue, but it's starting to rise up. Donald Cuspit, a contemporary art critic, wrote an article on reconsidering the spiritual in art, where he looks at Kandinsky's essay from 1913, where Kandinsky in 1913 is saying, our world is in danger. Materialism is destroying us. That's 108 years ago. He saw that buying your identity and buying your status was destroying humanity. And we've just gotten better at it, right? Much better at it. And globalization, thank God we can make one t-shirt and sell it everywhere and try to have everyone look the same. And Cuspit said that he thinks there may be a handful of artists that are willing to pay the price to revive the spiritual in their work. And it's my intent to be one of those if I can. It's like, in some ways, we just keep repeating the stories, right? I mean, if we look at during the census last year, I was thinking about right at Christmas time, and I was thinking about Christmas and the story of the Christ child is all set in the census. And I thought, we just keep doing, we keep counting, we keep looking for ways to identify where the power is, where the money goes. And it's not valuable for us as people. It doesn't really change anything. We only change things, but as a community, we actually live differently. We actually care for each other. We actually support each other. The beautiful quality of life where someone is loving, caring, patient, kind, generous. I mean, like, we would all want that. But that doesn't happen without the inner work. That doesn't just happen on its own. So to get there, we got to let go of things like power, greed, position, authority, these things that we are trained to think that's the answer, right? And in the last 20 years, you see 20-year-olds dismantle businesses that have been 3 generations in the making, because the big box store is going to come in and do it cheaper and just take them out. And we see it all over the place. I mean, I buy from Amazon. Every time I do it, I think, is there another way to do this? Right? Yeah. And I try sometimes, and it's really difficult. They've taken over the marketplace. So what can we do in small ways to make a difference? Well, for me, I have to go to my studio. And my activism is in my studio, and in my devotional life, in my meditation, my thinking. I got to work on what's wrong in me. I like the intuitive connection to the material. I like touching clay, not knowing what's going to happen. But I know these things are percolating in me, and I have a hunch something's going to go in a direction. It doesn't always go there. But so I want both. I want planning, but I don't want planning that makes me just illustrating this plan. I want planning that just sends me on a direction, and then I explore along the way what's happening. And so many of the connections in the room, some are a decade in the making. Like, I made a piece, it sat on the wall in the studio, it wasn't complete. And then I found this thing in a thrift store. I'm like, that's what it needs. And I come home and they go together. In the back room, you'll see an installation of rope and blocks and tackles and baskets and these small boats. Well, for the last 2 years, I've been making these small boats. I don't know why. I just thought I have to make these boats. So I made 100, 150 of these small boats. Raku fired them. I still didn't know why or what I was going to do with them. And then in my studio, I've been collecting rope. In fact, one of the block and tackle sets my dad gave me as a child. I'm sure he stole it off a job. That's just the reality. It's got paint marks on it that I'm sure are from a company in the 60s that he worked for, and they didn't want it anymore. That's the story we always got. And all of a sudden I realized the boats were like little fish. So they're in the baskets with the rope and the blocks and tackles. Then the boats become fish. I don't know all that. I just had to do it. And I didn't really know what it was going to look like till I got here and started putting it up. I actually had an assistant, Madison Lucas, one of my grad students, arrange the boats in the baskets. I thought, it doesn't matter where I put them. And so it was really beautiful to let go of that and have someone else part of that process. Yeah, the figures are almost always solitary in my mind. Maybe because I'm wrestling through my own sense of solitary aloneness. But there is a male and female back to back over here, which is unusual. They share a boat on their head. But occasionally that happens. But usually it's about this, because the thinking is solitary, the studio is solitary, the processing is solitary, and I tend to be an introvert, even though it doesn't look that way. I'm in my studio, I'm by myself, I'm reading, I'm thinking. I mean, I love teaching, I'm energized by teaching. In fact, I can't see not doing both. The teaching influences my studio influences my teaching, but the next body of work that I just submitted proposals, I'm trying to get 70 grand in grants. Got to get out there. I want to make a whole series of figures paired with thrown vessels that are 5 to 6 feet high, and have these pairing of vessel and vessel. So I'm thinking that might be fun. Even though I'm old, I have not done yet. I collect a lot of crap. I mean, a lot. I have to hold myself back and not go to antique stores or garage sales because I run out of space. I finally bought all of these galvanized lidded cans to put all the rusted crap so it looks a little better out in the back driveway. In fact, I have people give me rusted things as gifts, and like their spouses are like, "You can't give someone that as a gift." I'm like, "Oh no, that is fabulous." Rusted nails, rusted stuff. So I have a lot of it around. I have stuff on my studio. In fact, the baskets, I bought the baskets to hold rope, not even aware that they would work for this piece until a week before the show opened. I'm like, what am I going to do for baskets? And I'm sitting in the studio and I look and I'm like, oh my God, there's 3 baskets right in front of me. And they had rope in them. So that was like a gift. And I bought those years ago without knowing. I think it was at like Home Goods, in the back. Yeah, all of a sudden they have cool stuff sometimes. You're waiting for the spark. So you have these things together and you're waiting for that voice that, we're never alone in the studio when we're artists, right? We have all these conversations going on. It's never quiet because these things are all talking, and I'm trying to find the conversation that belongs together. Now, some of those decisions happened here when we were setting up. The nests on that piece, I didn't know, but I didn't realize the pedestal was that long. And so it opened the door, right? I think it's living with an expectation that the gifts are coming. And that you just have to be ready to grab the gifts when they happen and pay attention. I had a graduate student in a class last week. I think it's from the Tree of Life, is that the movie called The Tree of Life? Book of Life? I'm confused. There's a line that says, love is taking a moment to pay attention. And I think my job in the studio is to pay attention and to look for that moment. And when you see it, step into it, even if it's not planned out. There's a lot of artists, though, that have everything figured out ahead of time. And I think the danger is the work becomes illustrative. It could, because then it just becomes an illustration of the idea. I want it to be discovery. I want it to be a gift, an accident, something happened that I don't intend. That's what I'm hoping for, anyway. If the body holds up, I'm hoping it will. Making work, teaching maybe less, making more work. I don't see an end to it. So many people I know, older men, retire and die. And I'm just not interested in that scenario where people suddenly retire and they think they're gonna do all the things they never did. I'm doing them now. I've lived the life that I want to live for the last few decades. I just think I'll keep doing that. And making work, talking about it, writing. If you go to my website, there's a little option called Reflections. I write a page every day and it's published in a MailChimp form. And I've written 140 pages so far this year. and publish them through MailChimp. It says $25. That's so I can pay a designer to do that work. And then $5 of that dollars goes to a nonprofit to try to help out schools to have art happen in them. So if you're interested in that, that's available. It wrestles with some of these ideas. In fact, all this week I've been writing about this idea of the true vine. What does it mean to have a vine and have branches, and how that's an image of fruitfulness and community. So that's available. So I'm gonna keep writing, keep making. I have 2 fences to finish in my yard, I'm hopeful. Maybe even this year to be done with them. I have a 1909 Craftsman that constantly needs work, so that will probably not go away either. Because I'm a clay artist primarily, and I've been a clay artist my whole life. In fact, I remember my first Play-Doh dog when I was about 4. My family was at relatives in Alameda. They're all out in the living room, and I'm in the back room with Play-Doh, completely happy. I could just hear them laughing, and I was back there making this blue and red dog out of Play-Doh. I wish I still had it. I have it up here, and that's important. So I've always touched clay. We lived on an acre of land with horses and cattle, but I got to dig in the yard, and I could dig foxholes, tunnels. I could do whatever I wanted out there. And so I found myself loving the soil. And there was a section of clay on our property that was kind of a grayish purple. It had rotting vegetation in it, so it smelled a little bit like sewer. So all the kids in the area would go there knowing that our parents would not come near us. We had like guaranteed hours of playtime, and we would make these full place settings and have these parties, and always loved it. I just finished 30 years at Azusa Pacific University. Yeah, people ask me, why are you still there? And I'm like, I get to do what I want. They leave me alone. Our building's behind facilities. No one even knows we're there. We can raku fire. We can do, you know, we've got a blacksmithing back there. We've got welding, and it's just great. Facilities, people think we're weird. I'm like, you're weird. Artists are normal. We're the ones that see the world as it is. Everyone else thinks they understand it, but they don't see it. Sometimes you wonder how people can get through life. They don't see anything. I mean, my problem is I see too much. It's overwhelming, right? As artists, it's like we don't know. We have to create filters because it's all coming in. The shadows, the light, that construction project, the roadway, the color of that Chevy, usually it's a 78 or 79. You know, you see them and you identify them, and it's like, oh, I got to drive. I better pay attention to what's going on. And you see a cloud and the light's hitting it. And my wife's like, Bill? I'm like this. You know, life is so rich and so full, I don't want to miss any of it. And so I have this belief that we only have the moment to live. The past we can keep dragging back, right? Replaying it. I think of it like ribbon candy. You know, you keep bringing the past into the present, trying to fix it, and it doesn't ever change. Many times as you relive it, it's still what it was. And we try to bring the future in, usually with anxiety or worry, and it won't bend either. So we have this little moment by moment opportunity to be present, to be attentive, to be here, and that's really all we have. And so most people miss their whole life. I mean, how often? Cell phones, the enemy. We're instantly not present. We're instantly somewhere else. Even if it's solitaire, it's like, wait a minute, I just missed my life for that. I think it's a disease, and I'm struggling with it every day. It's like you post something on Instagram, it's like, ooh, who's liked it? It's important, but it's not important. So how do we stay present? Well, as an artist, I'm present with my materials. I'm present with my story. I'm present with the process. And that's a discipline that's really important. is staying present, being involved. All this was to talk about clay. Did you sidetrack me? You so like the feet on the standing figure, it's only one standing figure in this show. The feet are gripping the earth. I want the work to be attached to the earth, and then the figures are being stretched spiritually, pulling. And that idea actually starts with the Etruscans in Italy. They did these long, thin drawings. They called them spirit drawings. They were usually involved with their funerary rites. And then they started doing some long, thin sculptures in bronze. In fact, Giacometti saw those, and it changed his entire work pattern. And that's why his figures went tall and thin, because he saw these Etruscan pieces. A few years ago, I was in Scotland and England and got to see a Giacometti retrospective at the Tate Modern, and it had some of the Etruscan figures there showing the influence on this work. So people sometimes say, oh, you look like Giacometti, and now I just say, thank you. Giacometti's artistic, I think of it as a family tree, and I can trace my ancestors back to the Etruscans through all these artists. It's like we need to know where we belong, where we fit, right? In fact, I assign students this, and they're a little overwhelmed by it, but I want them to do the work to figure out, how are you wired creatively? Like when you go to a museum, what stops you in your tracks? What makes you stop and say, I want that, that's me, I want to make that. And then you start studying those artists and you realize you belong to this family of artists. See, we're not taught to trust our instinctual way of thinking. School wants to make us all the same. Yeah, and it's like, we don't need a bunch of worker bees. We need people with creative, unique thoughts and unique answers and solutions and creativity. And that's hard to find in a classroom of 40. It's very difficult for a teacher to do that work. And so our system doesn't really help that. In fact, the Politics of Creativity by Finley Eversole, he says that a 5-year-old is 90 to 95% highly creative, all of them. By the time they're 7, it's down to 10%. School just crushes it. An adult is down to 2%. So I've been working against education since I became a teacher. It's like I'm at odds with the very thing that I do. In fact, these grad students are having to write this project, and the syllabus has these expected guidelines. And I said I had to put those in there because some administrator is going to look at it. I want you to do something that's unique, that's yours, that's powerful. You're not writing it for me. I don't need to hear what you have to say. You're writing it for you, and I get to read it and enjoy it. But this is for you to figure out who you are as an artist and do that work. So education is really important to me, that people find their own voice, their own creative voice, their own visual voice, whether it's in word, in art, or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. I think if we did that well, we could influence all the other businesses by our creativity and by our non-linear thinking patterns. It's like artists don't have to have A and B to get to C. In fact, they know 2 + 2 does not equal 4. We just know that's not true. You know, because if you've got 2 dozen geese and then 2 pigs, you don't have 4, right? You've got 50. We don't believe the 2 has to be 2 integers. We know 2 could be all kinds of things. And our mind is open to that. We live in a place that isn't so linear. The Greeks had 2 words for time. They had chronos or chronology, this kind of day into day. They pictured it like a river moving in one direction. And they also had kairos. They called it deep time, or like a lake that's still. And the deep time is unaware of the river. You imagine if you've been someplace where you get so involved with something and you see a clock and it jars you, that's moving from deep time to chronos. So kairos living means what's great about it is you're never late, ever, because you're in a different time frame. It's fabulous. And you say you're an artist, and they're like, oh, okay. It's a great excuse. But Kairos is like when you're a kid and you daydream, and everyone's saying, stop daydreaming. I'm like, that's creativity. That's figuring out how your brain works. That's realizing that what's outside the window is so much more interesting than what's happening in the class, right? I mean, it's so boring. And that bird out there is so interesting, right? And the creativity that's connected to that. So Kairos and Chronos, I wrestle with all the time. So because I live in deep time, I have to learn to manage Chronos. I have to like wear this and like pay attention sometimes. I wore it on purpose today because I'm like, okay, they're going to be losing their minds if I just talk in deep time for 4 hours. Because that's where I would go. I would just go there and this stuff happens. So I think in my studio is a Kairos place. I think of it as a sacred space. I go there, it's protected. You know, I try to turn my phone off and it's separate. And I tell everyone, you know, only come and get me if something really serious happens. Like the cat throws up, you know, or something that needs my attention. We have a very old cat who every once in a while, yeah. And so for me as an artist, I want the poetic, the transcendent, the story, the fairy tale, the possibility, the narrative, the metaphor, all to be living. In fact, I have this thing where I try to live in multiple experiences simultaneously. So when I'm driving through the park at the end of the day, heading home, the sun's hitting the lake and the lake turns to gold. And part of me gets to go, alchemy. It's real. The lake is gold. It doesn't look that cruddy gray brown that it normally looks. It looks like liquid gold. So I can be a medieval monk experiencing alchemy in that moment. Or I can become the scientist and go, well, it's probably a combination of refraction, color, you know, the filtering of the sunlight, which is interesting too, or the sun just dropped its goldenness into the fluidity of water, right? So I try to leave all those alive at the same time. And I throw in a little bit of King Arthur and the golden years of Arthur as our golden king. So if I'm not careful, I'm going to hit pedestrians, ducks, because all this is happening in my head. And then you sit in front of the fire and you realize the wood is burning to give you back the golden rays of the sun that it soaked up while it was living. So it's continuing to give of itself. Because why are they yellow? Well, it's because the sun gave us the warmth in the wood. Or I'm sure there's some gas reason that's happening, right? And all of that is good. But to not just think there's one way, to live in multiple ways is really interesting. I encourage all of you to live in multiple realities. Be careful if you're driving or if you're walking, because you might crash into something. But it really is a wonderful thing. There's so much brain power we don't use. Why not have multiple channels happening at the same time? So my wife and I both went to grad school at the same time, which you can imagine how difficult that is. We're both working full-time jobs. Our first child is 4, and she gets pregnant with our second. And so we did it. And I was working at 2 places and doing grad school somewhere else. So I would drive home for an hour to be with the kids before I had to go back and teach a night class. So I do double commutes. I was up for every feeding and every change for both boys throughout their infancy. I was tired. I was cranky. My students suffered. but my boys knew my touch and my voice. And I was committed to be their dad as much as my wife was their mom. And I had this interesting goal. I wanted to raise warrior poets as sons. So my wife, who's a marriage and family therapist, much more clear on boundaries, we had to sort things out and what that looked like. So when she came home and our oldest was 2, and I had him holding a fire axe to help me take out this bush, she freaked. He has an axe tattooed on his arm to this day because it did something to him.
How about the support of your spouse? You commit yourself to your career and your findings.
Yeah.
So how is your, I don't want to be personal, but how does your wife deal with this? Is she accepting your way of life, the way you think in your mind? Does she understand you?
Just the other day, she looks at me, she goes, you're crazy. I said, you've had 36 years to figure this out. She goes, I know, but it still hits me like I didn't even know it was this bad. So I think levels of my craziness are still coming out. But I started taking her to galleries and museums when we first got together. And in fact, we went to see Sunday in the Park with George, the Stephen Sondheim play. And she's crying all the way home. And she goes, are you like that? And I said, kind of, yeah. She goes, I thought it was like a hobby, like my sewing. So it was tough for her to realize what she'd married. But she fell in love with art. We go to museums every time we travel. It's been a transformation for her. And in grad school, we're both studying the isms of the 20th century, her from a psychology point of view, me from arts. We had these amazing dialogues together. And of course, my goal was to make her like me. Any good spouse, right? Your goal is to change them into you so they'll just do what you want. Well, that didn't work. And I realized the difference is what's so exciting. It's so interesting. I mean, she is so organized, thoughtful, ahead of schedule. I'm like, I think I have another hour to get this done. I just started it and I have an hour to get it done.
You see her as finance. You see her as finance.
I see her as deep care, which is different. It uses science, but not in a way to dehumanize, but to more fully humanize. She worked with abused kids for decades, continues to work as a therapist with people that are broken. And she actually teaches a program training people to be therapists. So she's dedicated her life to the repair of the human spirit. And I've learned from her that our job is to hold hope for others and how difficult that is. And therapists are trained to hold hope, and the rest of us just want to fix them because it's so uncomfortable. And to learn to hold hope for someone without fixing them is very powerful. So my boys, I wanted them to be warrior poets. So I made them oak swords when they were little, metal cross hilts, bigger than they were, and I told them to go out and play. And they would come back bleeding. I go, yeah, that happens, go back out. My wife's like, what? I go, they will learn. Of course, the little one's got all the advantage. He can sneak in and wrap the older one's hands. I made them clubs. I put a 4x4 post in the back lawn and told them to beat it with all the energy they had. So they began to find a way to get out that and also to think. I mean, they've been around the table with us having theological and spiritual and artistic discussions at a very high level since they were toddlers. So for them to think abstractly is absolutely normal, and like our youngest has a photographic memory. So he's like, well, in chapter 3, in the Dubliners, and I'm looking at him like, okay. He starts telling the dialogue, and I'm like, I can't argue with you. You're brilliant, right? And they really have become loving, caring individuals that are also quite strong. In fact, my youngest is my bronze casting partner. Yeah, he's really good in the heat doing that. My oldest got an MFA in sculpture from Claremont. For years, he did all of the display work for Urban Outfitters, built all that stuff. He's now working for a company, Cinnabar, building designs. They just did The Secret Life of Pets ride in Universal Studios. So all the difficult cuts he made on the stuff on the walls. So everything with compound angles, he's really smart. Thank you for listening to my ramblings, to my, another question.
One thing I want to say is hearing that you have allowed each other to polish each other and not destroy each other
Right.
with your differences. Because different people attract, and there's a reason for it.
Right.
To balance us out a little bit, but not take away
Right.
from who we are.
Right.
And we're usually raised with change ourselves to make everybody else happy.
Right.
And that's hard to undo
Yeah.
when you've done it for years.
Yeah.
But you've grown with each other's
Right.
positive sides
Yes.
and not made it a battleground between the two.
We do have our battles, but that's just because we're human. But our goal has always been to celebrate each other. And so I've had the chance to go to Canada when she speaks at international conferences on the brain, and I get to tag along and find art people and hang out with while she's in the conference. And so we've really had a beautiful exchange. We're really privileged for the life we have. Yeah, and it's hard work, but it's worth it to do this work. I really appreciate your questions, the conversation we've got to have. Thank you so much for being here, for seeing the work. It means a lot to me.